Hi, this is Ted, and for the next hour, you'll be listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times, Monday, April 6th. Before I start, I want to mention that I'm in New York and I had a really busy day and I'm very tired. So if I fall asleep while I'm reading, please tiptoe quietly away from your radio so I don't get disturbed. Thank you. All right. I'm not going to read any of the leading news stories because I assume people have heard most of them elsewhere and they get outdated very quickly. But here's an interesting article, rather long, called Forget the AI Apocalypse. Memes have already nuked our culture. This is by Willie Staley. A friend told me a story recently about her son. He's about 9 years old and doesn't have much access to social media. One day this past fall, he came home from school and told his mom that the kids there were saying 6-7. He wanted to know what it meant. So she pulled out her phone and looked up an explainer video that tells, for those who have been similarly perplexed, a familiar story. A rapper named Skrilla said it on a song called Doot Doot. Audio from the song started being used in TikToks about LaMelo Ball, who is 6'7". Some goofy kid yelled it at a high school basketball game, which became another TikTok, and it went from there, aided no doubt by the fact that 6 and 7 are statistically quite likely to appear in that particular order. But what does it mean? My friend's son asked. Well, she told him, it doesn't really mean anything. This did not go over well. He was so upset that he couldn't get to sleep that night. The realization that this thing everyone was saying, could be meaningless genuinely rattled him. His heart and his mind, still innocent of the internet, were simply unprepared for the possibility that it could do this to people. My heart and mind are, respectfully, different, having been ravaged by decades of exposure to this stuff. But I had roughly the same experience learning about 6-7, and like my friend's son, I had a hard time shaking the discomfort. To me, what was unsettling about it is that it wasn't all that unusual. It was just an extreme instance of something that happens all the time. People in general, and children in particular, are constantly repeating phrases and concepts that they learn from their phones. Typically, they're under the impression that what they're saying means something because no matter how inane, these phrases refer back to things that could be said to exist outside the phone. Chopped unks, rizzlers, gats, things of this nature. That's all real stuff, or real enough anyway. The 6-7 meme was revelatory because of the immense gap between its symbolic payload, essentially non existent, and its cultural penetration. It worked like tracer dye running through our information ecosystem, revealing its functions and dysfunctions. And the strange thing about this meme or slang or whatever you want to call it is that our shared world of people, places, things, and events didn't factor into it. It simply flowed out from social media platforms into that world with an extraordinary degree of success and for no real reason at all, a secret message to us from the world within the phone. Or perhaps a demonstration of force. This is how things are going to be from now on. Maybe a decade ago, it still felt as if there were a wild expanse within your phone, a portal to a vast and sometimes terrifying alternate dimension. If the sensation resembled anything in the real world, it was vertigo. There was a bottomless pit in the palm of your hand. And since the mass isolation of the pandemic, that feeling has been replaced by a growing sense of claustrophobia. You can leave it in the other room if you want, but your phone still closes in on you. Even if you spend very little time online, there's little you can do outside the logic of the internet. It's a force that warps our reality, a cosmic background noise that is everywhere and nowhere. Something inhuman that's subtly reshaping our language, our politics, even our minds. Here's something that's almost too obvious to say. Most of what people do on social media is copy other people. This is particularly apparent if you flip over to a highly algorithmic feed. For you on X, Instagram Reels, the entirety of TikTok, catchy phrases, joke formats, funny audio clips, these repeat over and over and over again. This is obvious to the point of being tautological. The algorithm surfaces what people seem to like. Memes are memes only because people like them. And that's all true, but it also obscures something about their production and maintenance. This work is done by hordes of people who are jostling to be heard. To them, the meme is not just an idea or more likely a joke, but also a tool, one that offers legibility and reach, a way to cut through the noise. They are not simply creating it, they are in a symbiotic relationship with it, or possibly a parasitic one. In a 2021 survey, the Pew Research Center showed that lurkers on Twitter outnumbered the posting class by enormous margins. Even among users who did post, just 25% of accounts generated nearly all the activity on the platform. The same seemed to hold true of TikTok, according to another Pew report from 2024. One-third of American adults said they used the app, but among them, only 40% had ever posted a video publicly. The top quartile of adult users produced 98% of the publicly available content on the platform, a ratio nearly identical to what Pew discovered on Twitter. Pew may have found an iron law of social media use, a new mathematical constant, one that's essential to understanding the dynamics of these platforms. The culture of any given network is generated by a small minority of people with some trait, or more likely deficiency, that makes them desire this novel form of social competition more than others. And one way to ensure that you'll at least be in the conversation is to stay legible, to talk about what others are talking about, or at least to speak how they're speaking. So these people subordinate themselves to the logic of the platform and reshape their thoughts to suit it, in the process pushing these memes, slang, whatever, up the food chain. In this sense, the success of any given word or phrase is less interesting than the success of internet slang as a whole. The incentive structure of the platforms can now produce new units of culture practically without the need for human will, or more precisely, by warping our will to suit its needs. The slang term itself is but a grain of sand around which copycat posting behavior collects until it becomes large enough to pass through to the offline world. It's just like how slang used to work, only completely different. Shaped not by the needs or wants of a particular scene, place, or subculture, but by the incentives and logic of scaled digital networks. If you haven't become addicted to a social media platform, you may not be aware of what exactly goes on inside the head of someone hunched over a phone. It's not clear that addicts are aware of it either. Jonah Wiener, a contributing writer for this magazine, wrote about this phenomenon on Substack in a way I found alarmingly accurate. He described the experiment of thinking in tweets rather than normal thoughts, even when he was far from his phone, in this case, washing the dishes and finding he was low on soap. His first thought was to water it down to make the bottle last longer, but then everything that followed was deranged by the internet. Instead of having normal thoughts, he wrote, "Thanks to Twitter, I'd think something exponentially more inane and annoying, such as the masculine urge to water down the dish soap, or the two genders, picture of brand new dish soap versus picture of old diluted dish soap." It goes on from there. Men will dilute the last millimeter of dish soap rather than go to therapy. No, but the way I just diluted the dish soap. Every one of these joke structures is immediately recognizable to anyone who has spent a lot of time on X. What Wiener is describing is the imitative behavior that sustains and nurtures memes. But more important, he's describing what this behavior requires, which is the hijacking of your frontal lobe by the incentives of the platform. Disappear into your phone for long enough, and your phone will disappear into you, putting you to work for the platforms even in your downtime. People have taken to calling this brain rot, which isn't a bad term for it at all, not just because phone slang is stupid and annoying, though it is, but because it really does rework your gray matter. In 2024, brain rot was selected as the word of the year by Oxford University Press, beating out other meme words like lore, demure, and slop. Last year it was rage bait, another term for another kind of online distraction, which beat out aura farming, another meme. In 2023 it was Riz, which beat out beige flag. I never heard of a lot of these. Something from TikTok. Since 2021's Vax, Oxford has consistently given the word of the year to some sort of internet meme. Maybe it's because the public votes on it, but maybe it's because this is what our culture produces now. It almost seems like a direct challenge to the idea that language evolves to describe ever more of our world. What if it can instead degrade or become caught in the gears of a more powerful meaning-making engine? Around the time that 6-7 was corrupting our youth, something happened that I hadn't seen happen in a long time. A magazine article went viral. This used to happen a lot before Elon Musk acquired Twitter and made it more difficult to share links, further trapping its users in its increasingly right-wing hothouse. But this article seemed to speak to a culture-wide anxiety, one shared even or especially by the platform's power users. It was about something called gooning. You should probably read the article for yourself if you haven't, as it will prevent me from having to describe in great detail what gooning is. In short, it is a subculture of pornography addicts who masturbate for hours on end, often while live streaming footage of themselves to other pornography addicts. Golly. Practitioners refer to the spaces where they do this as goon caves, a particularly evocative term, not just because of the damp darkness it conjures, but also because it calls to mind the famous cave from the other terminus of Western civilization, the allegorical one. As in Plato's cave, in the goon cave, reality is replaced by representation, which in turn supplants reality for its prisoners. And just as in the allegory, even the knowledge of the outside world does not diminish the preference for the cave. One of the gooners confesses to the article's author, Daniel Kolitz, that his fear of the complexity of human sexual encounters is why he turned pornography into the direct object of his sexuality. It's a bit like becoming addicted to a smoking cessation aid, but then again, that's something a lot of people do now too. In fact, Kolitz's point is that whether we're gooners or not, I'd like to believe that most of us aren't, we're all doing something like this all the time, wasting hours watching internet videos, becoming obsessed with micro celebrities, and replacing real relationships with these synthetic substitutes. Does any of this sound familiar, Kolitz asks? Do you maybe know some folks who get up to stuff like this? It's not hard to find other online subcultures. I'll start again. It's not hard to find other online subcultures with some of these hallmarks that misdirect our impulses into a downward spiral. Twitch, which turns an interest in playing video games into the experience of watching someone else play video games. The podcast fans subreddit that inevitably turns on the hosts of the podcast. And then there are others that are almost entirely consonant with gooning in their total inversion of means and ends. Think of a phenomenon like Looksmaxing, in which men, inspired by an incel message board memeplex, alter their bodies, sometimes violently, in pursuit of a hyperspecific set of ratios thought to be most attractive. The foremost practitioner, a live streamer known as Clavicular, has said he may have sterilized himself by taking testosterone, which would be a slightly comical outcome for someone who's so singularly interested in how he is perceived by the opposite sex. But of course, the real object of his desire is something else, something alien and hidden within the works of the platforms. And in his virality, he has at last become worthy of its love. But you too may be gooning reality just by using your phone. Consider that TikTok is arguably the main vector for all youth culture, and anyone curious enough to keep up with it will get whatever it doles out. And even if you think You aren't keeping up with it. You may be anyway. My peers in the media like to joke that TikTok is the assigning editor of most trend pieces. So even if you're reading the newspaper, your view of contemporary culture will be shaped by it, by the few entrepreneurial types who tend to its perpetual stew of memes. There's at once a paper thin phantasmagoria and basically the only thing we get. Whether we like it or not, we are all in the cave now. Perhaps that's all that's left. And I have to mention that you're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. One of the big fears about artificial intelligence is that as it digests the entire corpus of human culture, it will eventually surpass us, revealing the hidden logic that guides our creative output, or at least prove more economical in comparison, good enough if hard to control. Infinite monkeys on typewriters, grinding away at no marginal cost. The concern is that we'll lose some essential human quality to the culture we consume, that it would be stolen from us either by robots more clever than we are or executives who never cared about culture anyway. But hasn't something like that already happened? Many memes we consider authorless really have a human origin point that has been lost under layers of accretion and mutation. But what's further fascinating about 6-7 is it had no author. Skrilla, for his part, claims to have recorded Doot Doot in 10 minutes immediately after crashing his car and seems to have been pulling in sonic references almost at random. The song interpolates music for children, Baby Shark, and rap songs that came out when Skrilla was a child, White Tea, A Bay Bay, in free associative fashion, which also seems to be how Skrilla wound up saying 6-7. It is something a different Philadelphia rapper often ad-libs on his songs in reference to his street, 67th, which is all the way across town from Skrilla's neighborhood. Skrilla doesn't like to give straight answers about why he said it, but would it matter if he did? The people making edits to the song on TikTok were referencing LaMelo Ball. The kid at the basketball game was referencing the TikToks. Whoever wrote it in fresh snow on my Subaru Forester back in December was referencing all of this, I guess. No matter where you look for a human author, you can't find one. Had there been one, though, I'd love to shake his hand because there's nothing stupid or inane about 6-7. On the contrary, there's something ingenious about making a meaningless inside joke out of two consecutive integers, at least if your goal is to see how far it can spread among 12-year-olds. It's too weird for a human intelligence to have come up with. Instead, it was conjured into being by something else, some entity we've created by disappearing into our phones for several hours a day. Maybe we could live peacefully with such an entity were its influence confined to the realm of jokes, slang, and pop culture. But it seems capable of influencing just about everything, even the government of the most powerful country in the world. It's no secret that the Trump administration adores its memes. Staffers have repeatedly made headlines with their gleefully nasty deployment of them. What's most striking is how fluent they appear to be and how widespread the habit is. Here's the Energy Department posting Simpsons memes native to X. Here's the Labor Department making sly references to QAnon. Here's the gutted Education Department posting a Franklin the Turtle meme about its own uselessness. But no agency has been willing to demonstrate its online bona fides quite like the Department of Homeland Security, which repeatedly makes posts drenched in imagery borrowed from the online right. GigaChad, a meme from 4chan, Agartha, an absurd joke about an Aryan paradise beneath Earth's crust, trapping people in crystals, something from a video game. All of it can be found on the social account of the law enforcement agency created to prevent the next September 11th. The sensibility also flows into a $100 million recruitment effort for immigration and customs enforcement, targeting people in right-wing spaces. According to the Washington Post, the digital recruitment ads are aimed at UFC and NASCAR fans, conservative podcast listeners, people interested in guns and tactical gear. On one hand, using data like this is a perfectly sensible way of recruiting or running any sort of ad campaign in 2026. On the other, it seems guaranteed to bring in ideologically selected recruits, plucked from niche online communities and summoned by winking right-wing imagery. Surely a law enforcement agency recruiting in this fashion might also find itself operating in ways consistent with the memes. America after 100 million deportations, as one infamous DHS post went, and counter to most Americans' sense of fair play. But these are the rules of replacing democratic feedback mechanisms with the pleasures of the cave. With so much of our world being so rapidly reshaped for such stupid reasons, it's hard not to feel as if we're living in one of the canonical AI doom scenarios without even noticing it. I'm thinking about the paperclip maximizer, a thought experiment laid out in the early 2000s by the philosopher Nick Bostrom. In Bostrom's scenario, an advanced AI tasked with making paperclips is unleashed into the real world without proper guardrails, prompting it to use up all available resources to meet its lone objective, possibly even deciding to turn us into paperclips. It's a parable in which slightly miscalibrated incentives lead to unimaginable destruction and catastrophe, as everything is reworked to fit the needs of the machine. And this is, not to sound too dire, more or less what happened to everything since the advent of social media. It took only about a decade, but now every day our phones churn out these paper clips. Lokenuan League, Coastal Grandma, 6-7, paper clips. That thing about the Roman Empire from a few years back, paperclip. Small, disposable, extruded, and shaped to fit the needs of the platform that spits them out. You can unfold them, try to twist them into new shapes, but they never quite lose the old form. Of course, you can pop them right back where they came from, and they ought to work. Hell, if you're lucky, sometimes two more come out. This is the informational ecosystem we've made, without really intending to. One that has reshaped all of culture by privileging the outlook of those who bend their will to the masses. One powerful enough to make a whole generation of kids shout random numbers for a few months. One whose totality is impossible to take in because little can be said to exist outside of it. Everything and everyone is plugged into it so completely that we can't know if it was a good idea or not. But it's fun. Everyone's having fun. And in the end, that's what's really important, right? And here's an article of medical interest. Federal agency unveils 3 potential osteoarthritis treatments. This is by Gina Colata. 3 years ago, a little-known federal agency announced its first big project. It would invest tens of millions of dollars over 5 years to find a cure for osteoarthritis, the painful wearing away of joints that affects 32 million Americans. Now the agency, ARPA-H, the Advanced Research Projects Agency for Health, says it has several promising solutions. Its research teams are contractually obligated to start testing in patients within 18 months. The new research focuses on knee osteoarthritis, but the investigators believe the solutions could eventually be applied to osteoarthritis in any joint. 2 research teams at Duke University and at the University of Colorado Boulder have developed injections or infusions that regrow bone and cartilage, they announced on Monday. And a 3rd team at Columbia University may have discovered a way to regrow an entire knee. The methods so far have been tested only in animals, but experts say they were encouraged by the findings. It's hugely promising, said Dr. Scott Rodeo, vice chair of orthopedic research at the Hospital for Special Surgery in New York, who was not associated with the studies. Right now, everything we have just modifies symptoms, he added. Curing arthritis by regrowing cartilage and bone would be a paradigm shift. Finding a new approach is the point, said Dr. Ross Urich, a program manager for the Osteoarthritis Project at ARPA-H. If your goal is just to publish a journal article, this is not the agency for you, he said. ARPA-H is part of the Department of Health and Human Services. It is modeled on a similar program at the Defense Department, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, which helped develop the Internet, GPS, and autonomous drones, among many other technologies. At ARPA-H, the scientists who applied for the arthritis funding, chosen from a range of companies, labs, and teams, agreed to solve the problem in preclinical and clinical studies. If their treatments are successful in humans, they must commercialize them. The investigators also must agree that their arthritis products will be tested in the groups most likely to need it, meaning that more than half of the clinical trial participants must be women, and the trials must include Native Americans and Alaskan Natives. If a treatment is approved for marketing, it must cost no more than 25% of the price of the current standard of care. Columbia University's team leaders, the biomedical engineers Clark Hung and Nadine Chahine, say they found a way to regrow a knee using an artificial joint made of a 3D printed scaffolding filled with bone and cartilage cells. Those cells grow into healthy bone and cartilage, while the scaffold slowly dissolves over about a year. The treatment is meant for so-called bone-on-bone patients who have lost all or nearly all the cartilage in their knees. Those cells grow into healthy bone and cartilage while the scaffold slowly dissolves over about a year. The treatment is meant for so-called bone-on-bone patients who have lost all or nearly all the cartilage in their knees. The cells that fill the scaffold can be derived from the patient's abdominal fat or banked donor cells. If the cells are taken from abdominal fat, the investigators isolate stem cells and then use biological modifiers to direct them to morph into cartilage and bone cells, a process that takes a month. Donated banked cells, on the other hand, don't have to change into bone and cartilage cells, Dr. Shaheen said. In the scientists' experiments, these cells did not provoke an immune reaction despite their origin. To see if the scaffold would act like a real knee, weight-bearing and flexible, surgeons implanted their experimental knees in cadavers and used robotics to test the joint's suitability for walking. The next step is to test the system in large animals, Dr. Chahine said. Their 5-year ARPA-H contract supplied the team with a bit more than $42 million. For academic research, this is like pie-in-the-sky money, she added. A federal grant is typically a little more than $500,000, but with a grant, no one is expected to take their work from theory all the way to marketing approval. At Duke, Dr. Benjamin Allman, an orthopedic surgeon, said the team's idea was to ask if they could get a patient's cartilage cells to regrow. At the very end stage of osteoarthritis, there are none left, but a vast majority of osteoarthritis patients have some cartilage cells in their knees. Could they make the cells start dividing and repopulating the knee with healthy cartilage? In osteoarthritis, bone gets thicker, changing the mechanics of the joint. Could they remodel bone to make the knee normal? The researchers tried a variety of medicines alone and in combination, and they ended up with 3 treatments. One, an injection, makes cartilage cells grow. Another shot remodels bone. The third, an infusion that can treat several arthritic joints at once, also makes cartilage grow. The idea would be if a patient's problem is mostly in cartilage, we would target cartilage. If it's mostly in bone, we would target bone. The treatments have worked in rats and mice. I tend to be very skeptical, but this surprised me, said Dr. Allman. Stephanie Bryant, a chemical and biological engineer who heads the team at University of Colorado Boulder, said her goal was to return the tissue to a healthy state with at most 1 injection. The group found a drug, a repurposed medicine already on the market, that worked in animals and developed a formulation that releases it in bursts over months. The drug, she said, resides long-term in the joint. Their tests included rabbits that got the equivalent of an ACL tear in humans. Like humans, they quickly developed osteoarthritis. Within 2 months after the injection, their knees had regenerated. The other animal model was a guinea pig that develops the sort of degenerative arthritis that often happens as people age. Once again, the treatment seemed completely effective for the knees. And you're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. But what about people with advanced bone-on-bone arthritis? The Colorado group has developed a mixture of engineered proteins that are injected into the joint and fill in the space where cartilage should be. These proteins recruit so-called progenitor cells from the underlying bone and induce them to regrow. Among the group's rabbits, it took just 3 months before all the injected material was gone. What was left was healthy cartilage. The team, said Dr. Bryant, was overjoyed. You do all of this work, have all these hypotheses, but you never know if it will work, she said. Very few of us get the opportunity to really push forward things we are working on, she added. This is an opportunity to really help patients. Now, here is an essay by Frank Bruni that's of particular interest, to me at least. It's called Teaching in an American University is Very Strange Right Now. And I have to say, because I was a teacher at a university, that it was getting strange when I retired. It's sweetly customary for college students filing out of a seminar room or lecture hall to thank the professor who has just finished jabbering at them, as if all that verbiage were a favor rather than a job. I'm amused by it and grateful for it every time. But my students this semester often murmur something else as well. That was depressing, one student said, not rudely, not as a complaint, but as an accurate summary of a discussion we just had about all the falsehoods and fury that thrive in the digital age. Another uplifting class was another student's sarcastic review of a conversation about the volume and variety of Trump's litigation against news organizations, whose economic and reputational woes are exacerbated by his attacks. Clearly, some adjustments are in order. But how do I describe this troubled world of ours, the grave crossroads we straddle, the mighty stakes of our decisions, in a manner both truthful and gentle? How do I gird my students for the uncertainties and obstacles ahead while equipping them with an ample store of hope? I've been on the faculty at Duke University for 5 years now, and this past one has been the most challenging and the strangest by far. That's not about Duke. It's about higher education. It's about America. It's about dynamics, chiefly this country's tilt toward authoritarianism and the rapidly accelerating advances of AI that render our tomorrows even hazier than usual. None of us knows what we're in for and up against, and that confusion crystallizes on college campuses, which are by definition gateways to the future. They're supposed to leave students with maps, routes, a destination, not with compasses whose needles gyrate this way and that. For much of the past decade, college students flocked to computer science, wagering that few majors were surer on-ramps to employment. AI has exploded that roadway. I teach in Duke's School of Public Policy, where many students point themselves towards jobs in government or nonprofit groups. The axe that fell in the first months of Trump's present term deforested that landscape. Those are just examples, and this is hardly the first generation of young people to face disruption and major economic shifts. I can't say just how unusual in a historic sense the unease that I feel around me is, but I can tell you that my previous 9 semesters at Duke are no rival for this one when it comes to the number of students who initiate conversations about what they should do next, what they should expect after that, where the country is headed, whether they'll have any real say in that. I can tell you that their faces are darker, their voices more tremulous. I'm like a magic 8-ball who can't disgorge the desired answers no matter how tightly it's clutched, how vigorously it's shaken. One of my faculty colleagues said recently that he'd never felt so inadequate as a mentor. Same here. And we are both dealing with an extraordinarily lucky group of young people, talented, driven, or connected enough to breach the sanctum of a highly selected university whose resources and range of course offerings rank it among the nation's best schools. Still, their advantages can't compete with their apprehensions. They're undoubtedly picking up on their elders' anxiety. We're trying to manage not only their fears and bafflement, but also our own. News stories about universities since Trump returned to the White House focus on huge funding cuts for research, which have led to painful belt tightening at Duke and other schools, on investigations into admissions practices and incidents of anti Semitism, and on fines, more or less, for institutions at odds with Trump's agenda. But the Trump administration's impact on campuses has been even more sweeping than that. There's a nagging sense of being surveilled by invisible eyes. No one wants to draw the White House's ire, so some of us deliberate how carefully we should watch our language, avoiding diversity and equity and the Trump administration's other dirty words. Some of us go out of our way to make our receptiveness to a broad spectrum of ideologies clear and not to play into progressive caricatures. But which adjustments are reasonable corrections of past mistakes? Which are defensible self-preservation, and which are cop-outs? And what's my purpose? AI isn't just upending the job market, it's raising questions about the necessity and utility of an array of skills. I teach writing, which is increasingly being outsourced to bots. Some are scarily adept at it, so should I pivot to bot maximization? Should other professors in other disciplines? But what puzzles me even more is how to respond to a concern wisely articulated by Robert Pondischio, a former public school teacher who is now a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, in several essays and public remarks. He has been sounding an alarm about the unbearable bleakness of American schooling, a trend that predates Trump's political ascent and that the president and his compatriots have used as populist fodder. If you simply listen to the stories we tell, Pondischio writes in a newsletter late last year, we promote a view of the world in which everything is broken, corrupt, dangerous, or doomed. But optimism, he argued, is an essential civic virtue. No society can expect its children to engage with a world they think has already given up on them. This world hasn't. If I've given my students the opposite impression, I've screwed up. I need to communicate that for all this country's current trials, it still brims with opportunities, its promises greater than its woes. And a blurry future isn't the same as a bleak one. It just asks today's college students to be especially nimble and patient. And it demands that those of us who stand before them work extra hard to find an honest balance between uncomfortable reckonings and reasons not to despair. In the Chicago Tribune, Edward Keegan regarded Trump's gargantuan White House addition as the architectural analog of his Boolean approach to all else. This ballroom design wants your lunch money. In fact, it wants everybody's lunch money. Oh, we're on to another subject here, I see. All right. Here's an essay called The War is Turning Iran into a Major World Power. This is by Robert Pape, a professor of political science at the University of Chicago who studies military strategy and international security. In recent years, the conventional geopolitical wisdom has been that the world order was moving towards three centers of power: the US, China, and Russia. That view assumed that power derived primarily from economic scale and military capability. That assumption no longer holds. A fourth center of global power is quickly emerging: Iran, that does not rival those three nations economically or militarily. Instead, its newfound power derives from its control over the most important energy choke point in the global economy, the Strait of Hormuz. The strait had long been an international waterway through which ships from all countries could travel, but the joint military campaign that the US and Israel began waging against Iran this year has prompted Iran to create a selective military blockade of the strait. Roughly one-fifth of the world's supply of oil and liquefied natural gas moves through the strait. There are no real alternatives to the supply route in the near term. If Iranian control over the strait persists for months or years, as I believe it may, it will drastically reshape the global order to the detriment of the United States. Many analysts believe that Iran's grip on the Strait of Hormuz is only temporary. A widespread expectation is that U.S. and allied naval forces will soon stabilize the situation and that oil flows will resume along familiar lines. That expectation is flawed. It assumes that to continue to control the strait, Iran must physically close it off. But as we've already seen, you can control the strait without closing it. Today, the strait remains open to tankers. Traffic has dropped by over 90% since the war began, though, not because Iran has been sinking every vessel that entered the strait, but because, given the credible threat of an attack, insurers withdrew or repriced war risk coverage. Hitting a cargo ship every few days was more than enough to make the risk unacceptable. Modern economies do not simply require oil, they also require oil delivered on time, at scale, and with predictable risk. When that reliability breaks down, insurance markets tighten, freight rates spike, and governments begin to look at energy access as a complex strategic challenge rather than a simple market transaction. The problem for the U.S. is one of asymmetry. Protecting each and every oil shipment that passes through the Strait of Hormuz against potential attacks, mines, drones, missile strikes, is a full-time operation. It requires continuous military presence. Iran needs only to hit an oil tanker once in a while to cast doubt on the reliability of the world's oil shipments. President Emmanuel Macron of France said as much on Thursday when he declared that it was unrealistic to open the Strait of Hormuz by force and that this can only be done in concert with Iran. He was all but admitting that the flow of oil cannot be guaranteed without Iran's agreement. For decades, the Persian Gulf had a simple arrangement. Oil producers exported, markets priced, and the U.S. secured the route. That system allowed rivalry without instability. Now it's falling apart. Gulf states depend heavily on energy exports for state revenue. When insurance rates spike and shipping becomes uncertain, the physical impact is immediate. Governments adjust, cargoes are rerouted, contracts are renegotiated. If uncertainty persists, the Gulf arrangement will inevitably change, giving way to a different regional order, one in which the Gulf states increasingly accommodate the actor that can most directly influence the reliability of their exports. That actor is now Iran. The global consequences will be most pronounced in Asia, Japan, South Korea, and India that depend heavily on Gulf energy. Let me read that again. The global consequences will be most pronounced in Asia. Japan, South Korea, and India depend heavily on Gulf energy. China, though more diversified, also depends on the region for a large share of its energy imports. Those dependencies are embedded in infrastructure, refineries, shipping routes, and storage systems that cannot be quickly reconfigured. If disruption to the energy supply persists, the effects will be widespread. Higher insurance and freight costs will raise prices. Trade balances will worsen. Currencies will weaken. Inflation will rise. Energy dependence will begin to shape policy. Governments will prioritize access to energy. Diplomatic choices will narrow. Actions that risk further instability will become harder to sustain. A 1970s world in which oil shocks lead to years of stagflation will no longer be a distant memory, but a nearing reality. Again, Iran will benefit. China depends on Gulf energy to sustain growth. Russia benefits from higher and more volatile energy prices. Iran gains leverage from its position at the Hormuz choke point. Each of these three nations has incentives that run counter to the economic stability of the U.S. and its allies. These three nations do not need to coordinate in a formal way. The structure of the system pushes them in the same direction. This is how a new order emerges, not through a formal alliance, at least not at first, but through converging incentives that reinforce one another over time. Other plausible scenarios in the emerging New World Order are darker still. Imagine Iran with control of about 20% of the world's oil, Russia with about 11%, and China able to soak up much of that supply. They would form a cartel to deny the West 30% of the world's oil. You don't need sophisticated analysis to recognize the catastrophic consequences. precipitously declining power for the US and Europe, and a global shift toward China, Russia, and Iran. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. The United States faces a difficult choice. Either commit to a long-term effort to reassert control over the Strait of Hormuz, or accept a new global energy arrangement in which U.S. control is no longer assured. If it chooses acceptance, the outcome is clear. The international system will reorganize with Iran as a fourth center of global power. Yet if the U.S. chooses to reassert military control, it's in for a long battle, one it could well lose. The Iran war is not a military conflict from which the U.S. can simply back out, with things reverting to how they were before. Iran would surely demand a heavy price and a new accommodation with the U.S., but this price will surely be less costly than that of the alternative future. This is a transformational war, and if these changes continue for even a few years, the global order will change irrevocably. And we'll finish up with some letters to the editor. This one is from Sean in Princeton, New Jersey. Since the United States and Israel launched their war on Iran on February 28th, the Trump administration has provided a range of justifications, none of them persuasive. This was a war of choice without a plan, strategy, or endgame. The war has now entered its sixth week. Neither the U.S. nor Israel has shown concern for the lives, the safety, or the future of the Iranian civilian population that they claim to be rescuing. Trump's rhetoric has become even more unhinged. He has declared that he will bomb Iran back to the Stone Ages where they belong if its government does not surrender. In his expletive-filled social media post on Easter Sunday, he included more threats of war crimes. It is as if Trump wants to take revenge on the Iranian people because their government does not bow to his demands. It is now time to invoke the 25th Amendment and remove Trump from office. He is clearly unfit and poses a danger both to his country and to the world. This is an extraordinary measure, but these are extraordinary times. Another letter, this one from Larry. Republicans, no mincing words. This is all on you right now. Will you stand by and watch, allowing this president, assuming he is indeed in control at all, to commit war crimes under the flag of the U.S.? Will you allow this leader of our nation, the land of the free and the home of the brave, that put it all on the line to help liberate Europe from fascism, to join the ranks of the worst dictators in modern history? There is no time for nuance and debate. We can continue these discussions later. You must join with your fellow members of Congress who are ready to stop this madness immediately. Your moment of integrity is now. And a letter from Laura. The man is deranged. The world is teetering. When are his enablers in the majority party in Congress going to wake up? And then some letters about the space mission. This one is by Jeffrey. I appreciate Peter Baker's parallels between the 1968 Apollo 8 and 2026 Artemis 2 moon orbit expeditions. As a 10-year-old boy, I was one of the many who watched the former with family members during Christmas week on one of the three major television networks. 58 years later, I viewed the latter with my family during Easter Passover week on NASA's YouTube channel. I observed babies in my family discovering their world, so it is no surprise to me that the adults never lost their childhood curiosity and desires for exploration, which helps explain why space travel captivates us. As in 1968, there are deep divisions in America. With the level of human intelligence contributing to space missions, it is tragic that we still cannot apply our brain power to navigating alternatives to fighting wars. But Marty disagrees and says, billions of dollars for the latest NASA testosterone fest? Wowza. There are a lot of folks living on the streets who would love to live in a home a small fraction of the size of a space capsule, but we won't spend billions of dollars to help them. Houston, we have a problem. And I still have a little time, so here's an article called I've Covered Women in the Workplace for 15 Years. Something Alarming is Happening by Joanne Lipman. Believe women was the defining message of the Me Too movement. Today there's a new one. Erase women. The Trump administration's attack on diversity, equity, and inclusion has rolled back decades of progress for women who now face a widening gender pay gap and narrowing employment protections. In the process, discussions about women have become a third rail, a toxic topic that is too politically charged to touch. Companies, universities, law firms, and cultural institutions are all expunging references to women and gender, even under the most benign circumstances. The Trump administration has defined illegal DEI as programs, initiatives, or policies that discriminate, exclude, or divide individuals based on race or sex. But in practice, Trump's allies have questioned whether women deserve a place in the workforce at all. They have blamed women for last year's California wildfires and slammed the conservative Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett as a DEI hire for a ruling they didn't like. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth is purging the military of senior female officers after complaining that the armed forces had become, in his word, effeminate. Women's names have disappeared from museums, parks, monuments, and even the Arlington National Cemetery. Terrified of being the administration's next target, organizations are descending into the realm of the absurd. A researcher focused on maternal health removed references to gender-based discrimination in order to receive federal funding. A medical trade publication warned scientists to avoid words such as female and women in grant applications. After Senator Ted Cruz of Texas released a list of supposedly woke National Science Foundation grants last year, ProPublica found that some were included merely because their project discriminations included words like female, as in a female research scientist, or diversify, as in the biodiversity of plants. It's a funhouse mirror movement. For more than a decade, while reporting on women in the workplace, I've seen my inbox clogged with companies boasting about their work championing female employees. But most firms I contacted for this piece begged me to keep them out of it. At a recent event about working women, I asked a room of human resource executives whether their firm's diversity efforts were continuing, and every hand shot up. When I asked who would talk about it publicly, almost every hand quickly went down. Executives say they fear not just the administration, but also right-wing activists and misogynistic trolls who might target them. Even companies with excellent track records in promoting women don't want to mention it. In a recent Harvard Business Review article, the sociologists Frank Dobbin and Alexandra Kalev identified several initiatives available to all employees that can actually be more effective than DEI programs in boosting outcomes for marginalized groups. They highlighted the successes of IBM's formal mentorship programs, Walmart's training academy, and Gap's family-friendly scheduling options. All three companies recorded increase in the percentage of women and people of color in senior roles. But don't ask IBM, Walmart, or Gap to elaborate on these impressive findings. I did. All declined. It may seem perfectly reasonable, even admirable, for companies to keep their mouths shut as they continue to advance diversity goals. After all, nobody wants to be a target. In previous years, too many companies went overboard with lots of cheap talk about diversity and not enough action. The problem is that silencing the conversation risks undoing years of progress at a time when women are still underrepresented in business and public life. As women are erased from the narrative, injustices against them go unnoticed. Already, incidents that in years past would have prompted public outrage are being met with silence. Just last month, in a stunning reversal, the U.S., for the first time in 70 years, refused to sign off on the UN's Commission on the Status of Women's annual principles, an anodyne set of statements including a reaffirmation of its commitments to gender equality and a call to repeal gender discriminatory provisions. A U.S. representative to the UN slammed them as gender ideology. My guess is that you haven't heard about this historic repudiation. It's not your fault. It got almost no public attention. Firms are even cutting funding for employee resource groups, affinity groups centered on women, ethnic and racial minorities, or LGBTQ communities, despite the fact that many aren't in the administration's crosshairs. In previous years, companies would brag about what they're doing, said Shelley Carell, a sociologist at Stanford University. Now companies are canceling ERGs that aren't illegal. It's an overreaction to what even Trump is asking them to do. As a result, last year, an annual report on women in the workplace found that women have less career support and fewer opportunities to advance. One previous champion of women's advancement, Meta's chief executive Mark Zuckerberg, now says companies need more masculine energy. Other marginalized groups have also been targeted. In the wake of George Floyd's murder in 2020, corporations jumped to make grand statements and pledge billions of dollars to combat discrimination. Most of those efforts, including initiatives to boost female employees, turned out to be empty platitudes or just plain failures. The erasure of women from the national narrative has long been a key strategy authoritarian leaders use to destroy democracies. In Turkey, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has declared that women aren't equal to men. In Russia, some forms of domestic violence have been decriminalized. And in Hungary, Prime Minister Viktor Orban's government has urged women to focus on childbearing, not its large pay gap. A primary feature of the autocrat's playbook is reversing progress on gender equality and women's rights. Now women's rights are eroding in the U.S. The Trump administration has called for resurrecting traditional nuclear families where the mother is a homemaker. J.D. Vance argued that having more women in the workforce results in unhappier, unhealthier children. The administration recently sued a Coca-Cola distributor for hosting a women's retreat, alleging it discriminated against men. Trump's allies have even suggested stripping women of the right to vote. When women mobilize, countries are more likely to be egalitarian democracies. That's why authoritarians fear women. The rest of us shouldn't. And you've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. This is Ted. I apologize for that gap in the middle. I hope you enjoyed this, and I look forward to being with you again next week. Have a good week. Bye.